The Roman Empire is one of the foundations of Western civilization. It's something that is ever persistent in our consciousness. For over a millennium, Western nations have all looked to Rome as the ideal of peak sophistication. Even in the modern day, we stand in awe of its grandeur, all the while standing on its remains. All roads lead to Rome, as the saying goes, but along with the grandeur also comes fear and dread, because even the greatness that was Rome eventually fell. Now, of course, when talking about the fall of Rome, I am of course talking about the Western Roman Empire, because no one thinks about the Byzantines. For the last millennium, Western nations have all compared themselves to Rome in one way or another, and the United States is no exception to this. In fact, the Americans have a unique fascination with Rome and its fall, and whenever things are looking bad politically or economically, people like to compare the United States to the Roman Empire, and proclaim its imminent fall. But is that really the case? Is the United States really in a position like that of the 5th century Western Roman Empire? Let's look at these claims. An increasingly popular comparison being made is that of the barbarians at the gate and unmitigated migration. The late Roman Empire had difficulty in maintaining armies manned by Roman citizens. Because of this, they resorted to recruiting barbarian tribes to maintain the borders of their empire. The narrative usually invoked here is that these barbarian mercenaries did not care about the culture or institutions of the empire and just wanted to take a piece of its wealth for themselves. With the barbarians now manning the gate, it was far easier for other barbarians to get in, and for them all to eventually overrun the Romans. In Europe, this comparison is being applied to Syrian and other Muslim migrants crossing into Europe through Turkey and the Mediterranean. But in the United States, this comparison is being made to migrants from Latin America. Here, the narrative goes that instead of violently sacking the Roman Empire, these new barbarians are financially sacking the overburdened welfare system, and threatening the culture by not learning English or assimilating. And of course, there is the classic go-to, they don't really care about the country if the first thing they did when coming here was break the law by being here illegally. Historians debate how big the role of the barbarian invasions was in the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Some believe that it was the primary reason, and others argue more that it was simply the final blow to an already devastated imperium. Even if we go with the former's claim that the barbarians at the gate are indeed the biggest reason for Rome's fall, is unmitigated migration from Latin America the best comparison? The barbarians invading Rome were, of course, armed and violently attacking Romans. Latin American migrants are, for the most part, keeping to themselves and are trying not to get noticed by law enforcement. The invading barbarians spoke unfamiliar languages and had a completely different religion and culture to that of the Romans. Latin American migrants mostly speak Spanish, a language that most people in the US at least recognize even if they can't speak it themselves. Along with that, the Latin American migrants are a part of Western civilization just like Anglo-Americans. They may be from a different subdivision of Western civilization, but they still come from it all the same. And on top of that, most of them are practicing Roman Catholics, a religion that the US is quite familiar with. But what about the financial burden to public welfare systems that is being compared to the violent sacking of Roman wealth? In some states, such as California, where they don't deny non-citizens, legally residing or otherwise, from receiving public services, they are quite a financial burden. But in other more fiscally conservative states, not so much. Now, the comparison to Muslim migrants to Europe are a closer match to the barbarians at the gate narrative. Now, I'm not saying that comparing the Muslim migrants to Europe to the barbarians that collapsed the Roman Empire is a good comparison. I'm just saying that compared to Latin Americans coming into the United States, it is a better comparison. So with this, I think we can give a point to the America is not the late Roman Empire column. Another reason given for the fall of the Roman Empire is the overextension of its military. It is said that the empire expanded its borders too far and too quickly to the point where its military couldn't maintain the empire. This resulted in the empire recruiting the barbarian mercenaries that eventually overran the empire. When the Huns invaded Europe, the Romans had to pull out of Britain, which let German barbarians take over. This is frequently compared to the state of the US military post-Cold War. The army is smaller, but in a lot more places. The exact number of US military bases overseas is unknown, especially those used for covert operations, but the estimates usually range somewhere between 800 and 1,000. Libertarians will use maps like these to compare the overextension of the US military to that of the Roman Empire, in order to support a non-interventionist foreign policy. You'll also often hear about the use of military contractors in comparison to barbarian mercenaries. I'm very sympathetic to libertarian foreign policy goals, but I'm afraid this comparison is not as strong as you might think. Of the 1.2 million active servicemen in the United States military, only 200,000 of them are stationed overseas. That's a total of 1 in 6 active servicemen. Now, for libertarians, that is way too high. But for a domestically secure superpower, that's pretty low. That number also gets less impressive if you include the 800,000 reservists in the US military, bringing that number down to only 1 in 10 soldiers serving overseas. And when it comes to the use of military contractors, most of them are veterans of the US Armed Forces, unlike the barbarians of Rome. And on top of that, the US military spending is at its highest level ever for peacetime. The US Armed Forces may be overextended overseas, but it's by no means overextended as a whole. So I'm afraid that's another point for the no column. A third big reason given for the fall of Rome was its broken economy. In the 200s, Rome had a political crisis that resulted in the empire splitting up into 3 parts for the better part of a century. During this time, the several self-proclaimed Roman emperors engaged in inflationary monetary policies, clipping and shaving gold and silver coins in order to make more coins. They used this new money to finance their respective militaries and governments, but it resulted in significant amounts of inflation, which increased prices for food and other goods. The system was in such a bad state that by the time the empire was reunified under Diocletian, he essentially had to declare all the old coinage to no longer be legal tender. He also put a system in place where subjects could pay their taxes in goods instead of money, which ended up establishing the foundations of feudalism. Those who think the US is on the verge of a Roman-style collapse like to point to the Federal Reserve's expansionary monetary policies of quantitative easing as being the equivalent to 3rd century coin clipping. Like the libertarian foreign policy, I am very sympathetic to this position, but I'm afraid the United States is not in the same state of desperation. The federal government hasn't declared all the old money to no longer be legal tender, and they haven't implemented a system of paying taxes with goods. The US also hasn't gotten out of a century-long civil war. Yet. So for now, I'm going to have to put this check in the no column. So as we can see, the US is not in quite the same state that the late Roman Empire was. But just because that isn't a good comparison doesn't mean that there isn't another comparison to be made between the current United States and some point of Roman history. When we think about Rome, we usually think about the imperial end of its history and its fall. But Rome has 1,000 years of history to look at. If you want to find a better comparison, then you need to go back to the 2nd century BCE. Rome had just defeated Carthage for a second time in the Punic Wars, and for the first time has no real challengers for dominance of the Mediterranean. The wars in North Africa brought a lot of money and slaves into the Roman Empire. The importation of slaves has driven down the cost of labor to the point where free Romans find themselves unemployed and unable to compete. And yet, despite there being no major powers that could compete with the might of Rome, they are constantly sending their legions overseas to put down a leader they don't like and put a new, more compliant one in their place. Throughout the Italian peninsula, there are people who serve in the Roman legions and support the economy, but they don't have the rights of Romans due to their lack of citizenship. The wealthy have bought up land that the poorer people could no longer afford to farm. This led to aspiring Roman politicians, such as the Gracchi brothers, to run populist political campaigns promising a redistribution of wealth to the lower classes. And in the city of Rome itself, mob violence began to assert itself in political matters, killing off political opponents of prominent politicians. If the current United States is anywhere along the timeline of Rome, it is the 2nd century BCE. The US is the lone superpower standing after 2 world wars and a Cold War. We frequently like to engage in military interventions to replace regimes and governments we don't like. American workers have lost their jobs because they can't compete with a laborer you don't have to pay. In Rome's case, it was a slave. In the 21st century, it's a machine. And the US has a sizable class of people living within its borders that contribute to the economy and yet don't have the full protection of the law due to their legal status. And we are seeing the rise of populist politicians who campaign on redistributing wealth or otherwise equaling the economic playing field. All the while, politically motivated violence and intimidation becomes more common and in some cases more tolerated. So if you're looking to compare the United States to a certain period of Roman history, it's not the fall of the empire we should be looking to, but rather the fall of the Republic. If you want to know more about this period of Roman history, then I suggest you read Mike Duncan's The Storm Before the Storm. It inspired a large part of this video. I wrote a review for the book for my website casualhistorian.com, which you can find a link to in the description below. Also down there, you can find an affiliate link to where you can buy the book on Amazon. You can also support this channel by donating on Patreon, where you can get rewards for your donations, such as getting to see the videos early or getting to see your name in the end credits. If you want to make sure you never miss a video, then you should click that subscribe button and hit the bell icon to make sure you never miss a video, because we never know if YouTube's algorithm will decide that you don't want to see these videos anymore. Don't forget to like this video, share it, and leave a comment below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.